Hey, this evening, before I share just a couple quick things, most of you guys know, some of you don't yet, but so I've only got a couple weeks left of student ministries here as the student ministries pastor. So next week's my last Tuesday night. So it'd be awesome to see you guys next Tuesday. I'll just have some kind of partying challenge for you. And then the other opportunity to see me before I go, if you'd like, is the Apologetics Conference, which Josh talked about this next weekend. And so the spots are starting to fill up for that. So if that's something you're interested in, just learning about specific ways to defend your faith and talk about real issues, I would encourage you to sign up. I think it would be good for anyone. For 6th and 7th graders, I would just check with your parents to see if they want you to attend. Some of the issues are kind of heavy that we're talking through, but 8th graders and up, for sure, I think it would be good for every single one of you to be there. Not just because I'm sharing, but because there's just a lot of really intense issues that we're talking about, things that you are faced with every day at your schools, and challenges to your faith that you're faced with. And so we want to talk about how you navigate those. So cool. So I got 2 messages left, and I've got a pretty important one for you tonight. I think is I'm saving two of my kind of favorite things for last as we talk about how do we build the right kingdom. We're talking about building the wrong one. So when I went to college, I would walk around. The college I went to was called Long Beach State, and a lot of colleges, there would be these people at the colleges that would always be protesting about different issues. They'd always protest about different issues. Like sometimes, you'd walk by and they'd be like, "Don't you know there's child soldiers in Uganda?"
Don't you know there's child soldiers in Uganda?
And they would be like, I don't know. And then they'd be like, "There's kidnappings in Chicago." And they'd be like, "Cool. You guys are really good protesters. It's on." Yeah. They'd be like, "There's kidnappings in Chicago." Wow, they're you're on, dude. They'd be like, "There's people killed in Syria right now."
There's people killed in Syria right now.
And they'd be like, "There's politicians stealing money."
There's politicians stealing money.
And they'd be like, "There's a civil war in the Sudan."
There's a civil war in Sudan.
And they'd be like, "There's oil spills off the Gulf of Mexico."
There's oil spills on the Gulf of Mexico.
And they'd be like, "They're changing Ronald McDonald's hair color to purple."
They're changing Ronald McDonald's hair color to purple.
And they're killing the fish. They're killing the fish.
They're killing the fish.
And they'd be like, "No, there's chickens. There's chickens and they're free-range chickens. And they're not free-range anymore. They're in cages. You monster!"
There's chickens. But they're not free-range anymore.
You monster!
You monsters.
And then they'd be like, "They're killing all the monsters.
They're killing.
Have you seen the Vampire Hunter movies?" Let's hear it for these college protesters. That was amazing stuff, guys. Really. Wow. I mean, those guys, they'd be really good at that. I recruited those guys, 1, because it was funny, but 2, because I was like, I wanted to save my voice a little bit, so I didn't have to yell, and then I had to yell anyway. They'd be like, but seriously, you'd walk around the college campuses, and they would be like, "You are evil!" And I'd be like, "Why?" And they'd be like, "'Cause you're a man! Men are evil!" And I'd be like, "I don't know, I'm sorry." And they'd be like, "You are evil! You hate chickens! The chickens! Do you know that 500,000 chickens are killed in Ohio every day? Every day they kill the chickens. They slit their throats. There's dead chickens everywhere. And then I was like just taking a bite out of my Chick-fil-A sandwich. I'm like, "I'm sorry." Like, I don't know. I don't know. They'd be like, "You monster. You monster." Every single year, hundreds of boats are sunk off the coast of Greenland. What are you going to do about it? And I'm like, I don't know. See, look, here's the thing, guys. Now, this is what this does. Now, look, you may not be on a college campus, but chances are that some of you, at least if you're not already on social media, you've heard of things on social media. Social media pops up and it does the same thing. It's like, you care about this. Care about this right now. If you don't care about this thing in Nebraska, what's wrong with you? You monster, right? Like, and they would there's things in your face all the time. And then here's the thing though, what happens is we get oversaturated with information that we can't control. We can't help all the things that are going on in Nebraska. I can't help, even if I wanted to, and I'm not helping by eating a Chick-fil-A sandwich, but I can't save all the chickens in Ohio, even if I want to. Now, but here's what happens. So this really great pastor, his name's John Tyson, he says this. He says, we know everything about which we can do nothing about, and we know almost nothing about that which we can do everything about. Now don't get me wrong. I'm not saying it's bad to know information about what's going on in our world. But what happens is we get so completely consumed by information that we can't control. Like I can list coronavirus statistics in countries that I'm not in, that I've never been to, right? Like I know more about Wuhan, China than I know about my neighbors. You guys see what I mean? I know all of this information that I have no agency over, which agency is a word to say I have no control. I have no control over things that are happening in certain parts of the world, and yet I fill my head with this kind of information rather than filling my head with information that can actually make a difference. So we give all our attention to what we have no agency in, and what happens is we get information overload, and when we have information overload, it leads to profound hopelessness. There's this term that's called compassion fatigue. Fatigue is, when you get tired. And compassion is when you're feeling that empathy for people. You're trying to relate, you're trying to care. But we get compassion fatigue. And the way what it happens is we get saturated with sad story after sad story after sad story after sad story of things we can control, and it wears us out. And wears us down, and it demoralizes us. And then what happens is depression and anxiety go on the rise. Do you know that depression and anxiety can directly be linked? Not that all cases of depression and anxiety are because of this, but it can be, the rise in depression and anxiety can be directly linked to social media. It's a 1-to-1 ratio. That the more social media you consume, the much higher chance you have of experiencing severe depression or anxiety. Now, this is because when we are consuming social media, we are experiencing different things. One, we're getting envious of the people around us. It's information we can't control. Or two, we're experiencing compassion fatigue because we're dealing with issues that we can't control and information we can't control. And so then what happens is, because of social media, something else happens. We have artificial community. And when we have fake community or artificial community, it leads to disconnected loneliness. We think we have tons of followers, but really we're alone. We think we're famous, but really we're not. And we sit there and we realize we're like, actually, do people even care about me? And we have these feelings of disconnected loneliness. Now, that's not just because of social media, but that definitely plays a factor to it. That we get information overload, which leads to compassion fatigue. We get all these fake communities, which leads to isolation. And when this happens, we suffer. There's this philosopher, his name's Robin Dunbar, and he says this. He says, we can actually only maintain, the human brain, the human psyche, can only maintain 150 connections at once. That we were wired. Now, this guy's not a Christian, so he believes it's because of evolution. But regardless, I actually think that there's some truth to this idea that the human brain, the human body is not wired to maintain more than 150 connections at once, which is the size of a village back in Jesus' day. That we would not be able to actually maintain real relationships with more than 150 people. Why? Because you were never built. You weren't created by Creator God to sustain a pace of life that is constantly changing, that is constantly, you gotta get this information, this information, this information. We were not created to be addicted to technology. We were not created to continually hear about the heartache of the entire world. And when we're hearing these voices on either side of us screaming, you monster, you don't care unless you do something about this. You don't care unless you do something about this. You don't care unless you do something about this. What happens is, we don't do anything about anything. And we shut down, and we sit down, and we scroll through Instagram, or we go look at TikTok, or we go play a video game, or we just go to sleep. Because we can't help everything. We can't help everyone. And so then the question becomes, okay, well, what do we choose to care about? Like, are these issues bad to care about? No, these issues aren't bad to care about, but we can't possibly do it for everything. So what do we care about? There's a German guy, his name was Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and he's this very famous Christian. He was in Germany when Hitler rose to power, when Adolf Hitler rose to power. And he actually got out of Germany before all the killings happened. He went to the United States, and he came back to Germany while Hitler was still in power, and he spoke out against Hitler, and he was killed. He was killed for it. But what he was doing is he said, I am a Christian, and I am a German. Therefore, I am responsible for Germany. Now, he had the power to influence a lot of people in Germany. But what if you applied that to you right now? I am a Christian. I am a 7th grader at a Tuscarora Middle School. Therefore, I am responsible for 7th grade at a Tuscarora Middle School. I am a Christian, and I am a member of this family. Therefore, I am responsible for this family. That was the ownership he took on. Those are the things that he chose to care about. His circle. And that's not to say he didn't care about anything else, but he focused on what he had the power to control. Now, God is using us in his quest to repair a broken and fractured world. And so then we think, well, how does it happen? How does it happen? Well, it's repaired one relationship at a time. There's a really famous Jewish philosopher. He's a therapist. His name is Irving Yalom, and he says this: it's the caring relationship that heals. It's the caring and nurturing relationship that heals a broken world. And there's another really famous Jewish teacher. His name was Jesus of Nazareth. And about 2,000 years ago, he said this. He told this story in Luke 10, 25 through 37. So if you've got your Bibles, or you want to look it up on your phone, that's great. We're in Luke 10, 25 through 37. I'm going to read it for you too. And just to set this up, Jesus has been teaching for a little while now. The Pharisees, these religious teachers, they're always trying to trip him up. They're always trying to get him to fail. And so they're asking him questions. That this one Pharisee gives him an example. At verse 25, it says, and behold, a lawyer stood up and he put Jesus to the test, and he said this: what shall I do to inherit eternal life? What will I do to get eternal life? And Jesus said to them, what is written in the law? How do you read it? And he answered, you shall love your neighbor you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, your mind, and strength, and your neighbor as yourself. And Jesus said to him, yeah, you're right. You've answered correctly. Do this and you'll live. And here's where the Pharisee gets it wrong. So he asks a follow-up question of Jesus. And he's trying to trick Jesus here. So in verse 29, he says, but he, desiring to justify himself, said to Jesus, and who's my neighbor? Jesus, who is my neighbor? Some of you have heard this story before. Jesus says this. It's one of his most famous stories. He says, a man was going down to Jerusalem from Jericho. It's this big, big, long, winding road. And he fell among robbers, and the robbers stripped him and beat him and departed, leaving him half for dead. Now, by chance, a priest was going down that road, and when he saw him, he passed on to the other side. Now, I was in Israel a couple years ago, and I saw a road similar to the road that Jesus was talking about. A lot of those roads are still there. They're incredibly narrow. They're like the width of this podium, right? They're about as wide as this. Which means when the guy says he crossed over to the other side, what is it actually saying then? He stepped over him. Because the priest said, oh, not dealing with that. And steps over, and he crosses to the other side. And then it says, now a Levite comes, and a Levite's another type of priest, and a Levite shows up, and he passes on the other side. So he steps over him too. And then Jesus said these words. that would have made almost everyone in the crowd gasp. He says, but a Samaritan. Now the crowd would have freaked out here. We've talked about this before. Samaritans, this culture of Jewish people versus Samaritans. Samaritans were the other. They were less than human. The racism and bigotry and the ways that the Jewish people treated the Samaritans were horrible in this culture. And so when Jesus talks about a Samaritan, the crowd's like, oh no. Oh, no. He is not going to let the Samaritan be the hero. No way. And so he says, but a Samaritan, as he journeyed, came to where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion. He went to him and bound up his wounds, pouring on oil and wine, and then he sent him on his own animal. He brought him to an inn, and he took care of them. And the next day he took out 2 denarii. That's a lot of money back then. 2 denarii, and he gave it to the innkeeper and said, take care of him, and whatever more you spend, I will repay you when you come back. Then Jesus looked at the lawyer and he said, which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell among the robbers? And the lawyer would have looked at him, he would have had his head low, and he would have said, the man who showed him mercy. So he couldn't even bring himself to say the word Samaritan. It's the man who showed him mercy. And Jesus said, go and do the same. So then the question for us is, when we get oversaturated with information that we can do nothing about, do we care about things that we can do everything about? Do you love your neighbor? Do you love your neighbor as yourself? And I don't necessarily mean our literal neighbors. I mean who Jesus is talking about, the people that are in need that are around us. But what's really interesting is I think it actually does apply to our literal neighbors too, like the people that live next door to us. A few years ago, a book came out, and it's called The Art of Neighboring. And it's written by these 2 guys, and they went around to all these churches, and they did a bunch of tests. They saw how the people in their churches loved their neighbors. Here's what they found. This is what they found. It's a direct quote from the book. There is no notable difference between how Christians are neighbors and how non-Christians are neighbors. That should really make us sad as Christians. Jesus literally said there's two big commands. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor. Love your neighbor as yourself. And we've gone, I don't know, did he really mean neighbor? Like, maybe he meant like, I don't know, some other people in a far-off land, or maybe he meant this random thing on the internet. Maybe he meant love this cause, or this cause, or this cause, and trying to love all these causes. No, Jesus literally meant love your neighbor. Love your neighbor as yourself, and we miss it. So what they would do is they'd use this chart, and there'd be 9 houses on a chart. And they'd look at the house in the middle, they'd say, put your address down in the middle. And then there'd be the 8 other houses around the chart, and they would say, fill out the names of your neighbors in the 8 houses closest to you. And some person was like, I live in the country. And they're like, put the 8 closest houses to you. And someone's like, I don't live in a perfect box. And they're like, no, I get that, but put the 8 houses close to you. And someone's like, I live in a triangle. They're like, no, just put the neighbors closest to you. So they'd write the 8 neighbors down that were the closest to them. And then they had to write one interesting fact about them. And not like their house is white. That's not an interesting fact, right? Like, it's interesting to me. Well, then you're boring. No, look, the thing is, that's not an interesting fact because they didn't actually know their neighbor. So you know what they found out? That only 10% of the thousands of people that they talked to in churches actually knew their neighbors' names. 10% of Christians in churches knew the names of their neighbors. And 3% could actually write down one interesting thing about them. In other words, Christians are failing at a 97% rate of loving our neighbor. Why? Well, it's because we're too busy. We're too busy. We have compassion fatigue, and we're focused on relationships that don't really matter. We have to slow down enough to see and love our neighbors. So in the same book, This Art of Neighboring, the authors tell the story. There's this huge group of pastors, and they invite a mayor in. They invite a mayor in to talk to them about what issues were plaguing their city and how Christians could change the city. They're like, Pastor, or the mayor, they're like, Mayor, tell us what would change the city. And they said, what's the one thing we can do to make a difference in our city? And this non-Christian mayor, not someone who follows Jesus, he tells them this. It's so interesting. He says, you know what? I'm really glad you asked. The number one thing that tons of research makes a difference in cities? Good neighbors. You know what changes a city? when there's good, healthy neighborhoods. Because you know why? Because there's more the good neighbors, there's at-risk young people stop being so at risk, crime rates go down, volunteering goes up, people take care of the yards, isolated people stop feeling isolated, the neighbors are looking out for each other, protecting their neighborhood, and so much more. When people step up and they're good neighbors, the whole community changes. And this non-Christian mayor looks at all of these pastors and he said, you know, if churches were really serious about making a difference in their city, then they would create good neighbors. But guys, is it possible? I mean, I know that a lot of us say we're followers of Jesus. And we go, yeah, Jesus, he's my Savior, he's my God, and all that. And that's true. He's our Savior, he's our God. But is it also possible that Jesus was actually a genius? Like, he was a genius. He's the smartest man who ever lived. And Jesus said, you want to change the world, you be a good neighbor. It's not getting involved in every single cause in society. Again, it's not bad to get involved in certain causes, but not at the expense of loving our neighbors. If you want to change the world, you're going to love your neighbor as yourself. That's his strategic plan for you and I to change the world. And if we estimate it for a second, there's about 200 students here every single Tuesday night. And if we took this seriously, if we said, you know what, out of our neighborhood, we are going to commit to knowing and caring for 5 out of 8 neighbors. And that's going to look different for everyone. But 5 out of 8, that's a D. D's get degrees, so it's fine, it's passing, okay? 62%, okay? Now look, if we said 5 out of 8 neighbors, we're gonna commit to loving. That could look different for all of you. I'm not saying like, go over and be your neighbor's best friend. They don't need a 6th grade best friend. What they need is, they need someone praying for them though. And they might need you and your mom to make them dinner. And they might need you to say, hey, I noticed that there's a lot of weeds in your yard. Would you mind if I just came over and just cleaned up the yard for you? I'd love to do that. Could you imagine if we actually took that seriously? And that if 200 of us cared for 5 out of 8 of our neighbors, again, that's only a D. It's a passing though, it's okay. Now, if we cared for 5 out of 8, 200 of us, think about it. That's 1,000 houses. That's 1,000 houses. Now, the average number of people in each house is 3. If you multiply 1,000 by 3, you get 3,000, which means that in this community, 3,000 people could be affected by this group. Just this group. 3,000 lives could be changed by just this group being good neighbors. That's awesome. Jesus gave us the way to change the world. He did it. He said, be a good neighbor. And if every church in the county did this, and if every state did this, and our country did it, could you imagine how much different our world would be? It would change the world. Like maybe Jesus really did know what he was talking about. That same pastor from earlier, John Tyson, says this. He says, very few people will be given the cultural influence and power to actually shape history. But all of us have unlimited power to change the world around us. Not everyone that's sitting out here is going to be some big shot businessman or a political leader or a famous athlete or a famous movie star. Maybe some of you might. Most of us are just going to be people that are trying to love our neighbor as ourselves. And if we do that, we change the world. We start changing the world around us, they start changing the world around them. I want to tell you just real quick, 2 quick stories as I close. This message has been on my heart for 2 years. It's because I went to Israel, and when I was in Israel, our guide was a non-Christian. He was a Jew, but he wasn't Jewish as far as religion goes. He was just Jewish culturally. He was an atheist. And he sat around and he said, you know, because in Israel, the hospitality there, the way that they welcome their neighbors, it's like unheard of. They love their neighbors. And he said, you know what's interesting is I never see Christians actually doing what Jesus told me to do. So why would I want to be a Christian? Because you don't seem to even care what Jesus said. And that shook me, guys, because I went home and I realized I don't even know half of my neighbors' names. much less of it. So I committed this last couple of years to loving my neighbors. And I know every single one of my neighbors' names. I've had a meaningful conversation with every single one of my neighbors. My wife and I have cooked meals for 3 different neighbors. We took care of some kids when their parents had to work and COVID. We have tried to love our neighbors, and it hasn't, honestly, it's not that hard. It just takes us enough time for us to slow down to do it. And again, I'm not saying that you loving your neighbors is going to look like me. It's different, right? I'm an adult, you're a kid. But I want you to think about, how can I actually love my neighbor? How can I apply what Jesus said? Because when Jesus told this story, he wasn't just talking to adults. He's just saying, this isn't like, well, when you're 30, then you start loving your neighbor. Until then, you hate your neighbor. Like, love your neighbors yourself. And you know what, guys? It's changed my heart. It's made me a better follower of Jesus. It's affected me in ways I didn't even think possible. I brought my neighbor to tears because I dropped off a meal at his house because I knew he was working 2 shifts, like a back-to-back shift. So we brought him dinner. All we did, we ordered 1 extra plate from takeout. We dropped it at his house, and he started crying because he was so sleep-deprived from work. And he couldn't believe that we would bring dinner for him and his wife. That's what it took to make a difference. One of our neighbors that are right across the street from us, I've been praying for them since we moved in. They've become good friends of ours. He's a science teacher, and he's not a believer, and his wife isn't a believer, and we keep thinking like, oh man, we need to invite him to church, and I kept making excuses, guys. He knows I'm a Christian, he knows I'm a pastor, but like, I've had so many chances to talk to him about Jesus, and I never did. And now I'm moving, right? So I'm moving to Seattle, and my wife and I were just like, we need to tell them about Jesus. Like, I don't know how, I don't know when. And we were talking about, and so Halloween, was a few nights ago. We did a little Halloween thing for my son. He's 15 months old, and we did like indoor trick-or-treating for him and his little cousins. And they would knock on the doors, and then we would open them, and we'd be like, hey, and they'd pretend it was silly. Anyway, we did indoor trick-or-treating, and I went home and I was tired. And my wife was like, hey, don't you remember we're supposed to hang out with these guys? And they've been pretty isolated with the whole COVID thing. They've got some at-risk people, so we were supposed to do just kind of like sit on our porches almost and just talk, and 6 feet apart kind of thing. And I was so tired. I was like, maybe we should cancel. Maybe we should just cancel. And you know what I would have done? I probably would have just scrolled through Instagram. And I probably would have read some news, and it probably would have made me sad. And I would have had people yelling, fix this, do something about this, you monster. And so what I said was, I was like, well, I don't know that I want to do this. And my wife was like, no, we promised them we'd do this, and I know we're tired, but we'll just go out there for like 20 minutes. So we get out there and we sit down, and our neighbor, we're doing some small talk, we're talking about the weather, like, oh, it's cold out there, and I'm like, sure is, just like typical neighbor talk. And then the lady says, hey, you're a pastor, right? I was like, yeah. She's like, I've been meaning to ask you this, like, and she starts crying. She says, I just don't know if I'm going to heaven. How do you know if you're going to heaven? And they've got a 4-year-old daughter, and they're like, my 4-year-old daughter asked me what heaven is like. And I didn't know what to tell her. And then her husband's like, yeah, do you have to get baptized to go to heaven, or are you fine without it? And then he was like, well, yeah, but are we good? Like, if we're good people, do we go to heaven? And like, we don't go to church, or are we going to hell because we don't go to church? Or well, what if we believe something early in life and then we switch? And I got to talk to them about Jesus, and I told them what Jesus did, and they listened to the story of the gospel, and I invited them to church, and we prayed with them. And my wife and I went inside and we cried. We just cried. And I was so excited that I got to share Jesus with them, but I was so embarrassed that I hadn't done it before that. Because I was like, God, you're bigger than this. This world, you're so much bigger than this, and our neighbors need you. Your neighbors need you. They need to know the love of Jesus. And if we started loving our neighbors as ourselves, guys, it makes a difference. We can give people the gift of our time. We give people the gift of our presence if we slow down and love our neighbors, and we end up changing the world that way. Let me pray for you. God, thank you for this night. Thank you for every student that's here. Jesus, you showed us how to change the world. God, forgive us that sometimes we think we know better than you. God, we were never meant to be machines that just take in tons of information and get compassion fatigue. And God, there's so much heartache in the world. There's so much brokenness in the world, but God, so much of it could be fixed if every Christian just loved their neighbor. It wouldn't solve everything, God. We're still in a broken, sinful world, but God, so much of it could be fixed if we just would slow down and love our neighbors. So God, I pray for the students at ABC Church. I pray that we would slow down enough that we would see and love the people around us. God, I pray for opportunities like we had with our neighbors. I pray that for these students, that they would have meaningful opportunities to share you. And whether they're sharing it by talking about you or they're just demonstrating your love through serving them or caring about them. God, I pray for meaningful prayer for them and their neighbors. God, would you use this church? Would you use these students, these young men and women to change the world around them? God, we can't all change the world, but we have power to change our world and the way that we are influencing the people around us. When we do that, amen. I love you guys. Have a good night. We'll see you next time.